Hello, I'm Mike Buchanan, founder and leader of the political party Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them. And joining me for this interview is Elizabeth Hobson, a gender equality activist and anti-feminist. Our guest is Don Lofendale, a retired Canadian lawyer. He's been examining the issue of abortion or reproductive choice as advocated by feminists. Don worked in the civil branch of a provincial justice department for 32 years. Civil branches of justice departments are government's in-house law firms providing a variety of legal services. Don's main area of practice was privacy law. He was part of a group that won a Service Excellence Award for innovation. Don entered university immediately after high school in 1971, and during the 1971 to 72 academic year, he was introduced to feminism, resulting in a lifelong interest in equality between the sexes. He received a BA in psychology in 1975 and then a law degree, his LLB, in 1981, with a call to the bar in 1982. Don, a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much. Delighted to be here with you both.
Thank you. My first question for you, Don, is this. What is the nature of a choice abortion?
Thank you so much for the question, Mike. If I might, I will start with the nature or the state of abortion law and the reasoning behind it before we got into choice. Historically, absent an issue like the life of the mother, society tended to prohibit abortions, of course. The belief was that it's invalid to solve a problem by killing a separate human life. And now these people who made these laws, mostly men, weren't without compassion for the people involved because it was typically an unmarried couple who were having what was then considered to be illicit sex. So the approach the powers that be, these men in power, took was, what's the minimum necessary responsibility we have to give this couple? And what they meant by minimum necessary was the least responsibility possible with no loss of life. So that required the woman to carry the baby to term. Now, at that point, though, they had the concept of choice. That was the timing of choice, because that's the first opportunity for minimizing responsibility without loss of life. So the woman could choose to give the baby up for adoption, thereby ending her responsibility, or she could choose to accept further responsibility and keep the child. Now, when the man, the father, was almost considered a stranger to this entire transaction, in that the woman didn't could give the child up for adoption, and the father did not have an automatic right of being the next in line as the other parent. There was probably a chance he could get the kid if he wanted to, although in fairness, probably few single men did back then, but it wouldn't be automatic. And I'm just guessing on this, but my guess would be a married couple who wanted kids and couldn't have one, or already had a few, so had a track record as parents, would probably be seen as a better family for that baby than a single dad. So I suspect guys would have had an uphill fight. Now, if the woman chose, though, to keep the child, then she, of course, was taking on a lot of responsibility. And what the courts did then, they allowed a thing called filiation proceedings, which was basically the woman proving that a particular guy to which she was not married was the father of the child. Now, I think the general proposition is that, roughly speaking, rights should match responsibilities. And here, maybe the principle got slightly violated, but not a big violation. Up to this point, the guys had no rights whatsoever, no responsibility whatsoever. He didn't have to endure the 9 months of pregnancy, body changing. The female did, of course. So what they did with these filiation proceedings was they said, just like she could give up the child for adoption, you, the man, should be able to non-violently walk away without ongoing responsibilities. But they did insist that the guy give a lump sum towards the contribution of raising the child. And in today's dollars, it would be $4,500. So you might have to save a little bit, but it's not a lot of money, right? Not a lot of money. Well, I like the look on your face, Elizabeth, because it is a fair chunk of change. It's not nothing.
Depending on who you are.
Depending on who you are. Now, it would be adjusted depending on income. So this is what we were taught was the average. That's what it more or less worked out.
I see.
Depending on what guys made. So, like, I'm going to guess it would mess a guy up maybe for a year or so. And again, it is a responsibility without any right whatsoever. It's not like he then gets child access or anything. He's still out. He's done. But compared to what we have today, it seems pretty reasonable. I mean, today we have the amounts of maintenance are through the roof. You can be a quote H. There's a case. Men have to pay if you were a married couple for a quote a child of the marriage. Well, a child of the marriage can be an adult who goes to university. And I saw a case quite a while ago now when things were less extreme, where a dad tried to stop the maintenance payments because the child of the marriage was 26 years old and working on his PhD. And the court said, no, you still have to pay. And what's completely bizarre about that is even at that age, you can't pay the kid directly. Even if you say the mom's not passing through the money, they don't care. You still have to pay her. So with that level of injustice, like the $4,500 seems like not so bad, right? It's
right.
Not perfect justice, but it's in a gray area. If that were our only issue, I wouldn't be doing a lot of complaining. Now that does bring us to choice abortions. And if I might, I'll start with the general concept of choice, because I've had some discussions with men these days about the whole concept of choice as a broader concept. And it's quite an amazing one. It is a sexist concept, I think, but there's an evil genius to it because it tends to appeal to women greatly. It's a responsibility evasion concept and an equality evasion tactic, but it does tend to appeal to relatively normal women, not just feminists. And the idea is this, that women do tend to get frightened, it seems, by a lot of things. And one of the things that women really get frightened by, it seems, is unwanted responsibility. But if everything's a choice, then you can move away from that responsibility. The classic example of that we've all known is, what does a woman always reserve? The right to change her mind. Because if one decision goes bad, you're going to get an unwanted responsibility, maybe even one that goes perfectly with the right you were exercising, but nevertheless unwanted. With the right to choose to change your mind, you can choose something else and evade the responsibility. And that just seems to resonate deeply with women generally, unfortunately. The specifically on abortion choice. So now feminists are already ahead of the game because they're dangling this carrot that women just kind of do seem to love. And I don't want to be completely unsympathetic to it. Like back in the day when, we're out in the jungle or the wild, they're smaller and more vulnerable and, especially vulnerable during pregnancy. And so, I may consider why women had a lot of fear. But I guess the disturbing part is it hasn't gone away in the modern age. If anything, it seems to have been magnified and supported. But with a choice abortion, Of course, the phrase became my body, my choice. I refer to this concept I've developed lately, or maybe a bit of insight. I call this the lie of the half-truth. And by the lie of the half-truth, I mean, someone will say something that's true, but it's literally only half the truth.
So, Don, sorry, we'll edit for that cough. And the only reason I'm interrupting is that you've got basically a minute. I mean, two at the most.
Okay.
Well, yeah, but if this is setting the scene, then surely we can make it longer and Don can rush through
Yeah. Okay. No. Yeah.
anything else.
That's a good point, Ellie. That's a very good point. All
Yeah?
right, Don. It's in
It's
your
up
court.
to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We can skip over one of the other ones that are less important.
Mm.
But the reason this is so important, the reason it's a lie of the half-truth is, yes, it's the woman's body, but it's the baby's body too, a totally separate human life. And one can say it's even more about the baby's body because abortion targets the baby and targets to end his or her life. So how that can be out of the equation is mind-boggling. And then, to a much lesser extent, a tiny bit the man's body, in that it does take a sperm and an egg to make a baby. And while our bodies aren't affected in the same way by abortion, certainly dads have an interest in the baby. They're not a stranger to the transaction. Excuse me. So the point of this lie, this half-truth, that it's about the woman's body, is to make us forget it's about the baby's body and that the man has an interest too. So it's not an untrue statement, but it's intended to deceive, the lie of the half-truth. And that's it for that. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, the lie of the half truth. That's such a feminist. They're so good at that.
Yes, expert.
There's so many of their narratives contain that grain of truth, but omit half of the story. I like that a lot. Now, I was hoping to ask you about the argument that some people who describe themselves as pro-life claim that abortion, or some arguments that support abortion, would also support infanticide. Have you examined that claim?
Yes, I have. I heard that from pro-lifers for years, but they
Mm.
never explained what they meant, which frustrated me, and I think weakened the whole argument. But it turns out it has some very real validity. Uh, Now, we started out when they were trying to have choice abortions creep in. The first test was viability. Could the baby survive outside the womb? Which struck me as rather absurd, because it seems to me now we've moved from viability, though, to autonomy. And the reason that has moved, the goalpost has been moved, is it's already the law in Canada, and states like the New York state want to, or maybe have brought in a law that basically amounts to post-birth abortions. So of course, it's almost obscene to refer to that as an abortion, isn't it? But the law in Canada, when our Supreme Court struck down our abortion laws, and I tell my liberal friends that means we have a state of lawlessness on abortion, which they dislike, but I think it's true, because what it then meant is that a baby is fair game until born. Well, born, our Supreme Court tells us, is when the baby's completely out of the mom. So if big toe is still inside mom, open season. And that's what they're going for in the States. Now, at that point, even that is pretty clearly infanticide already. But the argument the pro-lifers made before this became the law was based on the fact that in some societies, it goes back as far back as the Romans, for sure. I don't know how many other societies did this, but it was done. Parents could kill their child, with impunity up to age 2. And the reason that was allowable is that a child wasn't yet considered a human being. The mark of a human being is intelligence, and the test of intelligence is speech. And kids didn't start to talk till age 2. So kids could be killed at age 2 because they weren't quite human. And very similar to what we hear in abortion, right? It's a bundle of cells, it's this, it's that, even though we're now finding out as technology improves, rudimentary heartbeat at 6 weeks and face by 12 weeks. So sounds kind of human, doesn't it? But yes, that's the abortion arguments are consistent with infanticide arguments, and the pro-choicers, so-called, are proving that by pushing the envelope to post-birth so-called abortions.
Thank you, Don. Don, have you given any thought to issues concerning sex-selective abortions?
Yes, I have. This one is so bizarre and extreme and contradictory. Forgive me, I almost find it funny, even though it's not, but it's that insane and upside down. Feminists became alarmed when choice led to choice, what it meant choice for any reason. And they were fine by that until they discovered that some societies, some cultures more than others, tended to prefer to have sons. And so female fetuses, babies, would be sex selected for abortions. Well, feminists said, oh my God, this should be banned due to sex bias. Now, there's a whole series of things on this. I'll start with the one that's maybe least important, but is the one that I find makes it kind of funny. The West has been ludicrously, or let's just say extremely open to other cultures, frankly, so long as they're cultures of color, even when some of the values they bring in are fundamentally incompatible with Western values. Kind of those foreign values win usually. And if you don't go along with that, you're a racist. Well, the cultures that most prefer male babies and most likely to abort female babies are all cultures of color. So aren't feminists being racist? Because they're the ones that usually advocate for radical multiculturalism. So there's contradiction number one. Well, that's the waste of them. The one that boggles my mind the most is this. Their argument depends on the notion that at an early stage, at a stage you can still have an abortion, it should be banned because a baby is or will be a certain sex. Well, all babies will or are or will be a certain sex. So that seems to me would allow you to ban all abortions. That is to say, they're saying the baby is so human that it already is a girl, and so therefore you can't have an abortion, or the fact that it will be a girl is enough to ban you from having an abortion. But that's true no matter what sex the baby is. So they've completely undermined their whole argument for choice, but of course gotten away with it, even though it's an absolute contradiction. And then another little element of hypocrisy, feminists have claimed, again, I think unconvincingly, but unwanted pregnancies, unwanted child are likely to be abused. I understand these stats have been challenged, but that's their argument. And so they say it's better to be aborted in the womb than to be subject to violence afterwards. And feminists, of course, have a special concern about violence against females. Well, if it's female babies being aborted disproportionately, isn't that a good thing? Because then they'll be saving females from violence after they're born and are unwanted. And haven't feminists always said, better to be aborted than face that post-birth violence? So again, another contradiction they completely get away with. And on the final point, this is a new development, and I have no comment on it, rather than it seems to be out there. There is a thing in feminist circles about aborting male babies so they don't, quote, have to raise the enemy, end quote. And how hateful is that? And then on that, of course, they're just fine with sex selection, abortions. Their hypocrisy knows no bounds. And that's it for that one. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. I understand that you suggest that there is at least one historical issue that on the surface might not appear to be related to abortion, but actually has much in common with it. Can you expand on that issue, please?
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, that issue is slavery. And while on the surface it might not appear to be the same, a number of the underlying issues or conflicts are quite similar. See where to start on it. One is that, of course, slaves were considered property, and you can kill property. Feminists say, my body, my choice. Now, by my body, they really mean the baby's body. And what right do they claim? The right to kill. It's a property right. The two indicia of owning property that's alive are, can you sell it or can you kill it? If either one of those is present, it's property. And so one of those is present in abortion. Of course, also present in slavery, as I mentioned. But I mean, as horrible as it is to be owned, probably most people would say, well, I'll try to escape rather than I'd rather be killed. So of the two things, with slavery, there were more sales than there were killings, although they certainly happen. But with abortion, it's killing every time, right? Every time. So in that sense, it's almost a little more radical than slavery. There's also, that's probably the main issues, but there's been some other fascinating ones here in Canada. Now, it started with a case from the States called Dred Scott. And Dred Scott was a slave who escaped and then sued for his freedom. And the case stands for all sorts of things. I've looked it up now recently, and they don't teach us the main point that we were taught back around the time of law school 40 or 45 years ago. The main point then is that Scott lost his case because he didn't have the right to sue because he wasn't a person. So he had no standing. He didn't have the standing to bring a case for his own freedom. Bunch of interesting things there. We had a guy in Canada, politician named Joe Borowski, who was trying to challenge the abortion laws that he thought were too liberal. And our Supreme Court punted him on the basis that he had no standing because he had no special relationship with all the lives that were being killed in abortion. So the very same concept was used in both cases. Along the same lines, we had a famous case in Canada known as Persons cases, or the Persons case. And it was, I mean, there was a valid point, but of course, grossly exaggerated. And what happened was this: a woman was supposed to be appointed to Canada's Senate. It was going to be, I think, the first female appointed in 1930. And what had happened was, under the statute, to be eligible for the Senate, you had to be a person who, and one of the ABC, and one of them was owns property. Well, at the time that law had been passed, only men could own property. So the argument was, somebody made an argument, she shouldn't be appointed now, even though she does own property now, because back when the law was passed, she wouldn't have been able to own property. I do think it's kind of a silly, sexist argument against the appointment, and she won her case, and she was able to be appointed. So that part was just. But what wasn't just was this. They claimed, aha, they're arguing, the people that don't want her appointed, that she can't be appointed because she's not a person, because she didn't, a person who can be appointed is. So they said, aha, she's not a person. And so they actually, feminists, pretty much to this day, but certainly big time in the 70s and 80s, went around saying women weren't persons until 1930. Complete lie. But that's what they do base it on. Now, where this gets really interesting, there was two things as an aside. One was, there was a man in 1980 who tried to get onto welfare, as we call it, social assistance, state benefits, I think you'd say in Britain, because he was that rare man back then, well, still, who had custody of his kids. And he couldn't get welfare because to be eligible, you had to be a person in need. And to be in need, you had to be unable to supply necessaries for your children. And to be a person, you had to be a mother. So a person in need was a mother unable to provide necessaries to her children. He was a father, and so he wasn't a person. And he lost that case. He did. And which I think puts the lie to, it's all about the kids. No, it's not. It's all about the woman. Here, kids were going to suffer. Courts didn't care. And now where it gets even more interesting is Canada, under our current Prime Minister's dad, Pierre Trudeau, who at least was really smart. He actually had principles. You might hate those principles, but he had them. He was prepared to stand or fall on them. He brought in a Charter of Rights, much like the U.S. Hell of Rights. It got passed in 1981. Well, when that was being worked on, feminists worked hard to argue against the inclusion of the word person in certain clauses. And I forget exactly, because this goes back to like pre-81, but they might have wanted the word everyone or every individual instead, but they fought against the use of the word person in certain clauses for the very reason that they said this could be used to strike down women's abortion rights. So they're literally fighting to have a baby not considered a person for the very reason that it might lead to a laws being upheld that saves babies' lives. So they're excluding, well, they're trying to minimize or reduce the humanity of a baby, so they can exclude it from the word person, so they can protect it from charter laws, so they can kill the babies with impunity. Mind-boggling stuff, eh? But they got away with it. And again, very similar to the not a Dred Scott not being a person in the States. And that's it on that. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Don. Very interesting. Don, I understand you've examined a different body-related issue that argues against abortion. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, and this goes against the whole feminist thing. Back when I was in university, there was a book with the title something like Women's Bodies, an Owner's Manual. And it's this whole thing about owning a body. And our society got quite sophisticated on this. not only can we not, in general, own another body like property, we don't own our own bodies. You can't sell yourself into slavery, and you can't do a bunch of other things. If you um, commit suicide, or rather, if you're so mentally distressed that you're going to commit suicide, stop me if I mentioned this before, you will be put away and protected, like in a hospital, to save you from yourself. And the idea is we so little own our own bodies. We're stewards of our bodies, but we don't own them, that you can't just arbitrarily kill yourself because you're depriving society of a member of society, you. So it seems to me we have a much greater interest in protecting a baby from being killed than we do an adult person who wants to kill themselves, but we don't let people do it because we don't own our own bodies. We are part of a society, and we don't have a right to deprive society of ourselves. So that becomes that really shows how little property there is in a body. There was also, I mean, I'm sure this was based on British law, but I know it was in Canadian law. There used to be a crime. You'd be prosecuted for attempted suicide on the same notion. You're depriving society of a member. You don't have that right. But then, of course, you got a little more civilized and thought, well, this guy's got enough problems, right? Let's not prosecute people. Let's give them the mental health act help they need, not make his life worse. But like, that's how seriously they took, you don't have the right to deprive society of any member, even yourself. Now, where it gets really quite interesting, not only do we not own our bodies generally, we don't own parts of our body. And I think one can make a case quite powerfully on a case that only has positive sides, but yet we're not allowed to do it, even though it involves our bodies. And that is the sale of a kidney. People only need one kidney to live. There are people who will die without a kidney transplant. Let's say a poor person were willing to sell a kidney because the money he could get would change his life. He or she could go to university, could move to a different country, transform their lives. That is not allowed. And of course, it'll make the other person's life way better. Maybe they won't die. At the very least, they'll get off dialysis of 10, 12 hours a day in some cases and be able to live a normal life. That sale of an organ is pretty much prohibited everywhere, even though there's positive upsides for both sides of that transaction. Not like an abortion where one being's now dead. We find it so distasteful to see ourselves as property. We don't own our body parts. They're not for sale. That's not allowed. No part of us is property, not even owned by ourselves. And if we can prohibit something, and I think pretty much everyone would agree that's a good law, when there's upsides for both parties to the transaction, why on earth can't we prohibit activity like an abortion, where there's a huge downside to one party to the transaction, plus the dad in a lot of cases?
Mm. Are there any other major issues that you'd like to mention regarding abortion?
Yes, I'd just like to point out a bit of the hypocrisy, the feminist hypocrisy on the issue. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that everything I've said on this is wrong, and there ought to be choice abortions, at least for some period of time. Well, then the question becomes, whose choice? And one would think that, especially in a day and age of equality as sameness, that it would be the conceiving couple. Like, if one person is willing to take the child, one of the parents, how is that not enough? Even if we said the parent that doesn't want the child should be able to walk away and have no financial or other responsibilities, like, why is that not enough to save a life? if one parent wants to. And of course, feminists would go crazy on that. Yet, if you look at the productive realm, work, if a guy was worth $10 million and 1 cent, and he had earned every penny of it, and say he'd had a stay-at-home wife, when there's a divorce, she wants 5.5 million, right? Like she wants not only what his body produced, she wants it exactly right to the cent, right? So how do those things stand? I mean, they're not identical, but they are complementary, right? It's the productive realm and the reproductive realm. So, like, it just seems to me total hypocrisy. But of course, they do get away with it because they're feminists. And that's it for me. Thanks, guys.
Don, thank you. It's good to see the issue of abortion getting ever more traction in the men's rights movement year after year. It seems to be going up the league table, so to speak. I mean, the feminist position that abortion is an issue for women only strikes me as nothing short of obscene. So it's wonderful to see ever more men and women coming together with a joint wish to see an end to this Holocaust, because it is, to call it a Holocaust is no exaggeration. I mean, in the UK alone, since the 1967 Abortion Act, we've had, I think, 10.5 million abortions. I imagine North America is probably 5 or 6 times, if not more than that.
It is huge. Canada is so dishonest. We can't get straight numbers on it. The Premier of Ontario at the time, Dalton McGuinty, refused to have his government reply to a Freedom of Information request and said on what's the number of abortions in your province, and said, oh, we'll refuse to answer it and we'll amend the legislation. And to his credit, the judge said, no, this law is that you disclose information of this nature. There's no personal information. You're not identifying anyone. It's strictly numbers. But that's how extreme we are in Canada. In the States, there have been 62 million abortions since Roe versus Wade in 1972. If one has I don't know a word to use, kind of allows every kind of abortion that at least arguably is valid. So the life of the mother, obviously. Then the 2 gray areas to my mind are, or maybe 3, if there's going to be some physical harm to her, like kind of how much, is it going to last, that kind of thing. Rape and incest, because the baby's innocent, but it kind of seems monstrous, that if a woman felt a monster was growing inside her, like I wouldn't really blame her for that, even though the baby's innocent. So that's an area, to my mind, a gray area. And then, of course, if the baby has some significant defect. So if we give the abortion rights side, all the gray areas, the number of abortions that are choice abortions are still over, perhaps well over 90%. So that's a minimum of 90% of 62 million. That's about 55 million fewer Americans than there would have been, and that is a Holocaust. Women are literally aborting Western civilization out of existence. That's what's happening.
I don't know the legislation in North America, Don, or legislations, but in the UK, as I say, the Abortion Act was in 1967. And one of the huge lies right at the heart of that was that abortion can play a therapeutic role, and having an abortion can protect the mother's mental health. Now, it's 5 or 6 years since I spent a lot of time researching this, and 5 or 6 years ago, so that was close to half a century after this act was passed, there was no evidence from anywhere in the world of a therapeutic value of abortion for women. Quite the opposite. The evidence was of mental health issues for some women, at least. And how could that not? How could some women not regret it? It's kind of inevitable. But so 99% of elective abortions in the UK are on the grounds of the mother's, protecting the mother's mental health. and it doesn't do that.
Unbelievable.
It doesn't do that. It's revealed for what it was always was. It was a license to kill,
Exactly.
which is a great feminist dream, isn't it? To kill without
Without consequence.
penalty. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Of course, what they mean by mental health is, oh, I'll be distressed for a while. Oh, I'll be socially embarrassed. Oh, I'll be anxious. That's what they mean. Well, like, welcome to adulthood, right?
Yeah. And on that note, Don, I'd just like to thank you for a most interesting interview. It's a fascinating subject, and you've really, I think, brought a lot of nuances into it, which I've got to say I
Yeah,
hadn't heard before.
I've learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. As I say, I'm just delighted when you two interview as a pair, not just as an experience for me, of course, but every time I see it, you're great.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you.
That's very kind. And it's a wrap.